In this quick guide, I'll show you how to create a drop-down menu like this using only HTML and CSS. And just before we get started, I want to say that the source code will be available down in the description, so make sure to grab that at the end of the video. Now let's get started. I've opened up an empty folder in VS Code and I'm going to create a new HTML file called index.html and a new CSS file called styles.css. In our index.html, I'll call the exclamation mark, and this will generate our basic boilerplate. I changed the title real quick and make sure to link your CSS. So the styles.css will affect our HTML. And I've opened up our HTML with an extension called live server. This will enable me to not refresh the page every time we make a change, but this will automatically refresh. Let's get to our CSS now, and we'll make some general settings. The asterisk will select every element in our HTML, so we'll apply this to every element. I'll reset the margin to be 0, I'll set the padding to be 0, and I'll set the box sizing to be border box, meaning the border will also get calculated into the width of the object. As for our body, choose a font family and give it some background color and simple color. These are the ones I'll be going with. Now let's get to our HTML and start extending this. First, create a nav element with the class navbar. This is going to be the whole navbar that you saw up there. This is going to contain everything. Also create a div with the class logo. Inside this, put whatever you want, usually your brand name. And now also create an unordered list with the class nav-links. And inside that, let's create 4 link elements. This is a syntax you can use to create 4 link elements. Now while holding down Alt, I'll click into each and every one of these, and inside this create an anchor element. Now put some data into those, for example home, about, services, and contact. Let's jump back to our CSS and style whatever we have so far. I'll style the navbar class first. The navbar class is going to use display flex, meaning we enable flexbox, and this will also align all the links into a row by default. I'll say justify content space between this. This will push the logo and the links away from each other. I'll also say align items center. This will make sure that everything is adjusted vertically to the center. Apply a different background color for it. Make sure to give it some padding as well. For example, 1 rem from the top and the bottom and 2 rem units from the sides. And this one is going to be important. Make sure to set its position to be relative. The reason we need it to be relative is because it will be containing some absolutely positioned elements. Now one thing to note about this is that the relative elements hold the absolutely positioned elements as their children, meaning those absolute elements won't be able to get out of bounds, they will stay inside the current navbar. Now the z-index is going to be set to 10 and give it some box shadow as well. Now let's give a bit of a styling for the logo. Here we'll only change the font size, the font weight, and set a different color for it. Now let's style the nav links, and I'll choose display flex over here, meaning we will align them in a row, and I'll remove their list style. We set the list style to be none. Now as for the A elements inside the nav links, I'm going to set text decoration to none, meaning this will delete their little purpleness and the underline. I set their color to be a different one. Give them some padding like 0.5 rem units from the top and the bottom and 1 rem unit from the sides. And also we'll set a transition on them. This transition is going to be for their color, and we'll apply a 0.3 seconds ease transition, meaning when we hover over it, the color will change slightly and smoothly. And to make that actually happen, inside the nav links, the A elements hover event will get modified and set its color to be a chosen color of your own. Now if you try out our navbar, you can see that the colors changes. If I zoom in a little more, it's more visible. Now let's get back to our list elements, and the third list element, the services, is going to receive a class called Dropdown. And also inside that we'll be creating the Dropdown list that this will be rendering. Create an unordered list and give that unordered list the Dropdown-menu class. Now what we have to do inside the unordered list is create 3 list elements or however much you'd like, and also inside each of those, by holding down Alt, I'll create some A elements. Make sure to fill those up with some text. And just like that we have our basic HTML done. Let's move on to our CSS. In our CSS, I style the drop-down menu and set its position to be relative. Yet again, it's going to hold absolutely positioned elements, so that's why we need it. Now also come back to our HTML because I forgot that you see there is an A element and we need to give this a class of dropdown-toggle. This dropdown toggle will be needed, so when we hover over this, we can actually set some different styles for different elements. As for the dropdown toggle in our CSS, I simply set the cursor to be pointer whenever you hover over it. And now if you style the dropdown menu, we'll set the position to be absolute for these elements. We'll set their position to be a top 100%, meaning they will be close to their parent element, but their left will be 0. Set a different background color for this one. Set their padding to be 0 and their margin to be 0. Also disable their list style by saying list style none. Set its width to be 200 pixels, for example, or however wide you'd like it to be. Set its border radius to be 0.5 rem units. This will make sure the edges are a little rounded. If you save now, this is how it should look like on the left, but we'll continue the styling. Make sure to add box shadow to this, and we'll set its opacity to be 0, meaning we will hide the element by default. We'll also set a transform translate Y on it. This will give the subtle animation, because what we'll be doing is offsetting it by 10 pixel, meaning it will, when we animate it, it will have to come back 10 pixel. We'll set the pointer events to be none, meaning we won't be able to click it. And I also set a transition, and this transition will be set to all properties for 0.3 seconds with the ease transition. With this, I can now style inside the drop-down menu the list elements. All they are going to have is some border button given. While we are styling, I'll comment out the opacity change so you see what we are actually doing. As for the drop-down menu's list elements last child, I set the border bottom to be none. This will make sure that that line is removed from the bottom. And let's style the anchor elements inside the drop-down menu. They will be set to border radius 0.5, meaning 0.5 rem units, meaning we round the edges a little bit. Their display will be block, and we set a little bit of padding for them, like 0.8 rem units and 1 rem unit. As a last touch, give some color of your choosing from them, and a transition for their background color, because we'll be applying a transition effect. As for the transition effect, when they are hovered over, so change the hover event, we'll simply change the background color and the color. If you give this a try now, you won't be able to do it because pointer events is set to be none. But if I comment out the pointer events, you'll be able to see the hover effect for yourself. Now let me comment those back and hide these by default. What we'll be doing instead is modifying the drop-down menu's hover event, meaning whenever the drop-down menu is hovered over, and putting a space, we will change the styling of the drop-down menu. Whenever it's hovered over, I'll change its opacity back to 1. I'll change the pointer events back to auto. And I'll also say transform translate on the y-axis back to 0. 0 being the original place. Because remember, we offset it by 10 pixels, and this will give a subtle animation to the drop-down menu. And I mistyped this, put drop-down instead of drop-down menu over here, because that's the class we've applied by default. So if you hover over the services now, you'll be able to see that it appears. And also make sure to look out for typos, because the reason it was appearing on the left side is because I mistyped some of the classes over here. Now if you followed along correctly, this shouldn't be a problem. But in case you did exactly what I did, just make sure to look for typos. And the last touch that we'll be giving to this dropdown is a subtle fade animation. Let's change the dropdown's hover event. Whenever it's hovered over, we'll change the drop-down menus, list elements, and apply an animation for them. This animation is going to last 0.3 seconds. It will be with the ease transition, and it will have the forwards value. Now this will apply on animation, but make sure to copy this, paste it over here, and also remove the hover from them, because we also want to apply this even if it's not just hovered over, but here also set the opacity to be 0. This will make sure that we start from invisible and go in. but the animation's not yet created. Instead, what I'd like to do is create the keyframes for this, and it will be called fade in. Now set the from value. From opacity 0, it will translate on the y-axis by -10 pixel, and the to value, this should be set to opacity 1, meaning whenever the animation finishes, it should be fully visible, and its transform, translate y, should be set to 0, meaning it's going towards its original place. Make sure to apply this over here, fade in, and copy it to the top as well, where we apply the animation. Now there is a subtle animation when you hover over it. You can change and play around the values to make it more visible. And as a last touch, I'll add 3 different classes. These stylings will be for making sure that each element appears a little later, meaning we will delay the animation for this first, the second, and the third child. So if you hover over it, it's still very subtle, but they appear a little earlier than the other. So this appears earlier, then this later, and even later. So with this, our simple drop-down menu is done. I hope you found this helpful. If you did, consider giving us a like, maybe even subscribe. And other than that, I hope to see you in the next one. Happy coding and God bless.